Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. From wherever you're calling in from, thank you for joining us. My name is Bridget Burkholder. I'm with the 2050 Pathways platform, and I will be moderating this webinar today on net zero. I'm sure we're all very used to Zoom by this point, but a quick note on logistics. So please feel free to submit questions for our panelists through the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. We will have lots of time for discussion and question and answer after our presentations. So please don't be shy about using that box. You can either direct questions to specific panelists or just ask kind of general questions. We will also be doing a couple of polls through Mentimeter during the webinar to keep things interactive. So please have your phone handy or a window on your computer open to menti.com, MENTI.com, and we will let you know when it is time for the polls and also put that website up again on the screen so you know when it is time to use that. We're going to hear from 4 great speakers today. First, we'll have Richard Baron, the Executive Director of the 2050 Pathways Platform, and Kelly Levin, a Senior Associate at the World Resources Institute. Richard and Kelly will give us kind of an overview on the global state of play and the process for setting net zero targets. And then we have Archie Young, the UK lead climate negotiator in the COP26 unit, and Maisela Kekana, the Chief Directorate of International Climate Change Relations and Negotiations for South Africa's Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. Hopefully I got that right. I know you just changed your department name. And so these two will both speak to their national experiences with net zero, and Archie will give us a bit of insight into what we can expect for COP26. So as I said, we're going to do a couple of interactive polls during our webinar today. We want to hear from all of you that are here with us. So if you go to www.menti.com, MENTI, you can see that web address up on the screen here, and enter this code, then you will see our first set of polls. And please feel free to answer these questions. So we'll just give this about a minute for people to find the webpage and answer the polling questions, and then we'll have a bit of a better idea who we have on the call with us today. So you'll see the questions up on menti.com, and you'll also see them here on the screen. So we would like to know what sector you are calling in from is our first question here. And again, you can see the webpage and the code you need to enter for the questions here. See, these results are starting to populate. Great. I'll just give this a minute. Seems like we have quite a mix of people from different sectors on the call, which is great. And yes, as someone has pointed out in the chat, please use the code that's on the top of this slide to get into the poll. We'll give this just one more minute and then we'll move on to our next question. So yes, quite a mix here. It's great to see. Okay, and maybe we'll move on to our next question now. So we're also interested in what part of the world you are calling in from. I know we have some restrictions on time zones at this part of the day, but very interested to see the mix of the group that we have with us. I guess a bit unsurprising given our time zones, but we're seem to be a Europe and North America dominated bunch so far. All right, we have a couple people calling in from elsewhere. And maybe then we'll go on to our third and final question for this part of the poll. So are you currently or have you previously engaged in the design of a net zero target? And I know that the text is a little bit small on this slide here, but it should be easy to see on your webpage. Give folks a minute to answer this one. So again, quite a mix here, but it seems like we have a large proportion of people have been somehow involved in net zero targets so far. And for those of you that haven't, hopefully we can give you some new information during this webinar. All right, I think then we can move on to the beginning of our presentations, and we will have one more polling session at the end. So hopefully you'll have your Menti all ready to go. So first, we're going to hear from Richard from the 2050 Pathways platform to do a bit of a kind of global state of play on net zero targets and speak a bit about long-term strategies. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Well, I'd like to start by tracing back what we call net zero emissions to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change that was signed in 2015. Countries then agreed to a long-term temperature stabilization goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And this objective means that by the middle of the century, there should be a balance between sources of greenhouse gas emissions from transport, industry, electricity, agriculture, and others. So balance between those emissions and the so-called sinks, essentially carbon dioxide absorbed through forest growth. And this balance results in net zero emission net. The momentum for net zero targets has been growing rapidly, and the US election result is another addition to that, with President-elect Biden's pledge to have the US reach net zero by 2050. The whole of the G7 and most of the G20 countries have taken up this goal. And in just the past month, we also saw China, Japan, and South Korea set new and more ambitious net zero targets. So net zero emissions has become undoubtedly the long-term goal for climate action. You'll see on the map here that countries are at different stages with their net zero targets. At the moment, 22 countries have adopted these targets, either through legislation or in a policy document, such as nationally determined contributions, that is the short-term emission pledges, or the long-term low emission development strategies. These are two instruments under the Paris Agreement, and these are shown in blue here. Some countries like China and Canada have made political commitments, but they haven't yet released a detailed plan to achieve these goals. They are shown in purple on the map. And recent analysis from Carbon Brief actually shows that, including the US, more than 3/5 of global emissions are now covered by net zero targets and 3/4 of global GDP. Now, in addition, in green, you'll see members of the Climate Ambition Alliance, a group of 120 countries committed to achieving net zero by 2050, including a number of small island states that may not appear here. It will be important for all these countries to develop their own strategies to net zero to be able to introduce policies and drive investment in this direction. Now, countries are not alone in this move to net zero. They are being backed by many initiatives of non-state actors. I'd like to mention briefly the Race to Zero campaign. It's a global campaign bringing together initiatives of subnational governments and private sector actors committed to reaching net zero by the 2040s. At the moment, there are 452 cities, 22 states and regions, 1,101 business, 45 investors, and a little bit more than 500 universities. The Race to Zero dialogues are going on this week with many of these actors, and I encourage all of you to watch and see what innovative policy and business solutions are being developed in the Race to Zero to fasten the transition to net zero. So these are critical because they are the real life, the real economy examples that net zero is feasible in a range of sectors and territories. And these are examples that can be replicated in other countries. As an example, you have a number of Indian companies that are adopting net zero emission or 100% renewable energy goals, which can only help the country eventually move in this direction as a whole. Now, in parallel to the net zero objective, the Paris Agreement asks countries to elaborate long-term low-emission development strategies. These strategies are meant to show how countries will achieve this global long-term goal while fulfilling their legitimate development aspirations. At the moment, 19 countries have submitted official long-term strategies to the UN. They are shown in red and brown on this map. Not all these chart a path to net zero. Some countries submitted them years ago and are now working on revising the strategies in line with net zero. By the next UN climate change meeting, COP26, we expect that about 50 countries will have submitted their long-term strategies. Those in yellow here are among countries currently working on it. These long-term strategies are important because they indicate practically how countries plan on achieving their long-term goals and show what near-term actions and changes are needed to put their emissions on the right pathway. A net zero pledge is really only as strong as the underlying plan. And so we look forward to seeing more countries like Japan, South Africa, Portugal, and more indicated in brown here, showing how they will fulfill their pledge to net zero. But let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I should have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar for all of you tuning in that this will be recorded and we will be able to share a recording as well as being able to share some of the slides. So don't worry about taking any frantic notes while we're going through these presentations. Next, I will turn it over to Kelly Levin from the World Resource Institute. Kelly.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bridget. If you go to the next slide, please. So as Richard mentioned, we see tremendous momentum building around net zero target setting. And we recently published a paper that aims to support countries in designing and communicating net zero targets, as well as making sense of them for analysts. And I'm going to run through 7 recommendations that stem from our paper for considerations when designing a net zero target. If you go to the next slide, please. So first, what's critical is a robust process for developing a net zero target. There are significant opportunities associated with a net carbon future, but there are also going to be winners and losers and trade-offs along the way to achieving that vision. And robust stakeholder processes play a critical role in surfacing and managing trade-offs and promoting societal buy-in and ensuring a just transition. And additional to stakeholder processes, another consideration is the legal status of the target. And depending on the national context, a law or some other binding policy may be the best instrument to send long-term policy signals and drive changes in near-term decision-making. So I've shown here several countries, including Sweden and the UK and France and Scotland and Denmark and New Zealand, adopted formal legislation enshrining their net zero targets, a legal commitment that is going to ensure that net zero targets are truly transformative instruments rather than just aspirational visions that don't really have any kind of bearing on today's decisions. If you go to the next slide, please. Second, we would recommend that net zero targets cover all greenhouse gases and sectors. The latest science makes it clear that achieving the Paris Agreement temperature goals is going to require unprecedented changes across all sectors in the economy, and also will require significant reductions of all greenhouse gases. So accordingly, a net zero target should cover all greenhouse gases and sectors. Most countries that have adopted net zero targets include all greenhouse gases and sectors. New Zealand, for example, excludes biogenic methane. China has not made it explicit what the coverage of the net zero target is. In addition to domestic sectors, Countries should also consider including emissions from international aviation and shipping, which occur outside of national boundaries in their targets if the highest ambition is going to be reflected in the target. So for example, the UK established a net zero target that includes international aviation and shipping, but Norway and Sweden explicitly exclude these emissions from their net zero targets. If you go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Sorry, go back to 3. Thanks. Third, we would suggest aiming for net zero by mid-century or earlier. What we know from the science is that to achieve a 1.5 limit in temperature increase, global carbon dioxide emissions on average reach net zero by 2044, and all greenhouse gas emissions on average reach net zero by 2066. This doesn't mean that all countries are going to achieve net zero at the same time. So for example, a small handful of countries, including Bhutan, for example, already have net negative emissions, while others are aiming to achieve this by 2050. But essentially for the math to work, any net positive emissions from one country by 2044, 2066, depending on the greenhouse gas, will need to balance out with net negative emissions in another country. What we stress in our recommendations is that the countries with the highest emissions, the greatest responsibilities or capability, should adopt the most ambitious target timeframe. So this means that major emitters should adopt a timeframe that is at least as early as the global timeframe to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, and earlier still if they have high historical per capita emissions and capacity to mitigate. What's critical also is beyond net zero, countries should supplement with plans to achieve net negative emissions after achieving net zero emissions if they have the capacity to do so. Currently, countries with net zero targets have established a number of different timeframes. Many specify specific years between 2030 and 2050. Some, like Singapore, use references broadly to the second half of the century. Notably, Japan changed its target with a reference to the second half of the century to 2050 just recently. Go to the next slide, please. Fourth, we recommend that net zero targets should also include an absolute emission reduction target. Countries should specify separate decarbonization targets from the removal targets. And if a net zero target doesn't specify the necessary greenhouse gas emission reductions, the achievement of a net zero target might rely too much on very high rates of carbon removal. And there's a significant uncertainty about the scale and availability of future carbon removals from both land-based carbon and technological solutions. Distinct targets can have a very clear roadmap for decarbonization as well as scaling removals. So we've seen that in Sweden, for example, and Sweden has a goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2045 and net negative emissions afterwards. And they have a separate target in 2045 that emissions from activities within the country need to be at least 85% below 1990 levels. So that implies that either carbon dioxide removals within Sweden or investment in mitigation in other countries can meet up to 15% of that 2045 target. Go to the next slide, please. The next recommendation is that governments should prioritize reducing emissions and enhancing removals within their own territory rather than relying on international transfers to achieve net zero targets. This would send really clear signals for domestic mitigation and investments and avoid lock-in of carbon intensive infrastructure. And if countries do use international transfers, we suggest that they should establish limits to the amounts of transfers, ensure robust accounting, and also limit it to surplus mitigation from other countries. And certainly to complement the approach, you would need to make sure that we have access to finance provided to developing countries so that they can achieve their own targets. Some countries have adopted net zero targets without the use of offsets. France, for example, specified that it will not use international greenhouse gas mitigation transfers to reach its net zero target. On the other hand, some countries envision meeting their targets with the investment in reductions and removals elsewhere. Sweden and Switzerland, for example, plan to use a limited amount of international transfers to reach their net zero target. If you go to the next slide, please. Sixth, be transparent. clear communication of a net zero target to both domestic and international stakeholders is going to be really critical. This is going to make sure that these are true, genuine commitments rather than appearing as political greenwashing. We suggest a long list of transparency criteria for a net zero target, including, for example, greenhouse gas sector and gas coverage, the time frame, whether or not there are any decarbonization targets, any use of international transfers and limits. This is a mock-up of a forthcoming module we have on Climate Watch, which we're collaborating with ECIU on, that shows those net zero targets that have been adopted in law or policy and their underlying assumptions, which we will be releasing in the coming weeks. And next slide, please. And seventh and lastly, as Richard said, a net zero target is really as good as it influences everyday decision-making. Countries should ensure that net zero targets inform near and midterm climate action, and this includes NDCs, importantly, targets and policies, development plans, investments. For example, interim targets, say for 2030 or 2040, can set periodic milestones, which can guide the pathway towards net zero targets. One tool that's been used is carbon budgets, which limit emissions over a multi-year timeframe, which France and New Zealand and the UK have already established. Go to the last slide, please. In conclusion, here's a link for the paper that we have recently published, and it just highlights that decision makers face several choices when designing net zero targets, and these choices should really maximize the contribution of net zero targets to drive decarbonization in a way that is commensurate with the scale of the climate crisis and helps achieve the Paris Agreement. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Richard, for really setting the scene for us before we hear some national experiences. And I'm sure that the WRI colleagues can share the links to those resources in the chat so that people can access them easily. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Archie Young, the UK lead climate negotiator in the COP26 unit. Archie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just please bear with me while I bring up my slides. 1 second, please. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, can people see some slides which are unfortunately at the end? There we are. Very good. Okay, well, after that inauspicious beginning, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you all, and it's always a delight to share a platform with good colleagues, and very nice to see in particular Marcella again, because this is something that we talk about often amongst ourselves as negotiators, and it's always appreciated when organizations like WRI bring us together to compare notes, to share experiences, and to see how we can all improve and help each other on this journey. I'll say a bit about plans for COP26, then a bit about UK experience, and then look to the future, if that's okay with you. So in terms of working towards COP26, well, this discussion is very timely. As incoming presidency, we are working towards an ambitious, inclusive COP26. And to be clear, when we talk about ambition for COP26, we are talking about ambition across reducing emissions, adaptation and resilience, and finance, as well as, of course, leaving no other issue behind. But I'm aware that most of today's conversation is probably going to focus on reducing emissions, but for COP26, we are absolutely focused across all the pillars of the Paris Agreement. We see the long-term strategies as a core part of that. And next month, on the 12th of December, we will be convening a virtual summit for world leaders to really champion climate ambition. And for that summit, we are setting out the expectation, as is there in Paris, that countries will come forward with new enhanced nationally determined contributions, adaptation communications, finance commitments where appropriate, and of course, long-term strategies. But I should say, we're not just focused on commitments. And the other two bullets on this slide, the Race to Zero dialogues and UNFCCC climate change dialogues, I think are good examples of that. The first, the Race to Zero dialogues, that's happening right now, and we're thoroughly involved, and we see that as hugely important in terms of bringing together non-state actors in order to drive real progress as fast as possible. And also the UNFCCC climate change dialogues. I think there's over 70 events over 10 days later this month and early December, in order to continue to make progress in the multilateral process. And we, as the incoming presidency, alongside Chile as the current presidency, we will in particular be convening discussions on adaptation, finance, loss and damage, on preparing NDCs, an open dialogue with observers, and other events as well. Now, of course, COVID has had a huge impact on all of us and all of our plans. And first, of course, express my solidarity and sympathy to everybody who's been affected. We've had many friends and family and members of our team affected. And as we work through trying to move the process forward in light of COVID, we face many challenges. The conversations that I had with partners when we were looking to postpone COP26 in the first place were not straightforward. But one of the clearest messages we heard was that the postponement of COP26 could not mean the postponement of climate action. And I think through the next 5 weeks as set out here, but also all the other summits and meetings that are happening at the moment, whether that's Financing Common, the Green Horizons Summit, the LDC Summit, so many other meetings, I think that is proof that we are continuing to push the political momentum, the multilateral process, and the real world action that everybody expects. But now on to working towards net zero. And in this, I would point to this diagram, which shows net zero at the middle, but really it starts on the left. It starts with the science. And all of our work, all of our commitments, all of our policies must be underpinned and informed by the science. Then moving down, we have governance. And that's because once you have policy informed by the science, and then hopefully targets, commitments, announcements, those need to be rooted in domestic legislation and articulated in long-term strategies. And then moving to the top, those need the buy-in, and they need to be influenced and shaped by and include all of society. This is not a straightforward transition. It needs to be a just transition, and it needs to include everybody in that conversation. And then moving to the right, they have to set out a clear pathway to the Paris goals. And in that respect, they need to be stretching, ambitious, commensurate with our international commitments, but also there needs to be that clear line of sight between our short-term targets, our nationally determined contributions, and our long-term strategies and long-term commitments as well. As you'll see on that slide, we are not alone in taking this journey. Over 100 members of the Climate Ambition Alliance and the Carbon Neutrality Coalition have said that they will undertake this process, or are doing so, or have already done so. And as mentioned, the Race to Zero dialogues are a hugely useful opportunity for businesses and civil society and communities to come together and demonstrate how they are going through this process themselves. This is not just a national government process. This is a process for everybody. And I think I'm right in saying that the Race to Zero dialogues now roughly 25% of the world's CO2 emissions are covered by institutions, organizations, businesses that have signed up to take part in that. We obviously recognize the commitments that have been made recently by countries, as was mentioned, China, Japan, South Korea, and others. And we look forward to those then being articulated in long-term strategies submitted to the UNFCCC. So that is, if you like, the theory. I'll turn now to the UK experience. And I hope this timeline shows that we are at least trying to abide by that theory. What you have on the left here are institutions, science and advisory bodies. The top one, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, no longer exists, but the Committee on Climate Change does. And what you have on the left is scientific and advisory bodies. And on the right, you have the government processes, the programs, the policies, and the legislation, which then articulates that. And what you see is, over the years, UK policy being informed by the science. And if you look at the numbers on the right, you see the ramping up. You see the 2050 ambition going from 60% reduction on 1990 to 80% reduction on 1990, through to net zero, as legislated for last year. And I think we were the first major industrialized nation to enshrine that net zero 2050 target in our legislation. But even that isn't enough. As you can see, there's the need to reflect that in terms of what is then submitted to the UNFCCC. And also you see the underpinning, the rooting in government processes in the two cabinet committees that I mentioned there, one chaired by the Prime Minister and the other chaired by our Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who conveniently happens also to be the COP President designate. Just another word in terms of the UK experience on that is from a personal experience of that shift from an 80% reduction target to a net zero reduction target. And that really changed the conversation, because I think it's fair to say that when it was 80%, far more than 20% thought that they were part of that 20%. Lots of sectors, lots of businesses, lots of parts of society thought, oh, well, fine, yeah, 80%, that's fine, but I will get special treatment. I will still be able to emit. I will still be part of that 20%. And the fact is, when it shifts to net zero, there's no hiding space. Everybody must get on board. And that has really galvanized those conversations and incentivized action across all sectors. It's also, of course, incentivized action in terms of the sinks as well as the sources of emissions as well. But the ongoing process is really important in this. So the invitation is, of course, to submit long-term strategies by 2020, but it doesn't stop there. And we all need to keep reflecting our increased ambition in our short-term targets, like I said, but also in our long-term targets, constantly going back to the science, seeing where more can be possible, where we can go further and faster. And I think that the global stocktake in 2023 will be a really helpful opportunity on the global stage to look again at that. But that doesn't mean that we individually as countries need to wait until then to ask ourselves those questions. And in March, we published the first phase of our transport decarbonisation plan, and we have further plans coming on energy, heat and buildings, natural environment, and going through that process of working through each sector, looking at what is possible, looking at where the emissions can be reduced, I think is a really powerful and useful exercise, breaking it down, but also being very clear. We all know what that beacon says that we're all working towards. I mentioned some of the lessons learned, and I'd point you all to the work of our independent advisory board, the Committee for Climate Change. And they've published a series of insight papers. Apologies, that's a very long website for you to turn to, but if you go to the CCC's website, you can follow links to there. And we're also always keen to engage in conversations like this and hear experiences of others as to how we can do that. And we welcome the work of WRI. I remember discussions at the G20 in particular in 2018 in Argentina, where you did a policy paper looking at the different long-term strategies that have been submitted up to that date. And we had a discussion about what that meant for our own national circumstances and plans. So that hopefully gives you a sense of some of our plans for COP26, some of the UK experience. I'll just end on a personal note. And forgive me if you saw this on my Twitter feed. So a few weeks ago, my daughter brought home this book, A Place for Zero. She's 6 and she's learning about zero at school. And it was just at the time when I was reading the plans for the Race to Zero dialogues. And I thought, isn't that uncanny? But apart from a nice link there, actually, that final page, I thought, told us a lot. It says, did you find what you were looking for? And Zero nodded. And he said, I just wanted to mean more than nothing. And now I think I've found my place. And why is that relevant to this conversation? Because so often we talk about net zero and it feels like this big, intangible, aspirational, far away figure. But actually, no, it has meaning and it needs to have that meaning. It needs to be, its places everywhere, and it needs to be rooted, like I said, in the science, in our domestic and our international plans. It is not abstract, it is tangible, and it is something that we're all working towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie. Lots of great points there and a nice way to end. And so lastly, we will hear from Mycella from South Africa's Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. And South Africa is one of the most recent countries to have submitted a long-term strategy to the UNFCCC. So great to have you here with us and looking forward to hearing about your experience. Over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Yeah, no, thanks, Bridget, and thanks to WRI for inviting me. And always a pleasure to see the colleagues, and greetings to all, both the panelists and all the participants. I've been asked to talk about South Africa's experiences on this. Let's see how technology behaves. Right. Well, from South Africa, we've always had a long-term view on climate change. And we have sought to take a careful technical analysis and engage in robust consultations. You know, we don't want to leave anyone behind as we do these things. So just briefly, in 2005 to 2007, we engaged in what we call the long-term mitigation scenario. This was the first long-term national stakeholder dialogue and technical analysis of where South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions could and should go in the long run. So this was really the first step in terms of science and the consultations. And just before COP 17 in 2011, we published the National Climate Change Response Policy, which was South Africa's long-term emission trajectory benchmark range. So this is when we introduced the notion of peak, plateau, and decline. And this goes right up to 2050. Then in 2011, there was also a national development plan from South Africa's National Planning Commission, which sits right in the presidency. And if you read the National Development Plan, it also talks about, and I just want to quote directly from the plan, over the long term, with realistic, bold strategies and global partnerships, South Africa can manage the transition to a low carbon economy at a pace consistent with government's public pledge without harming jobs or competitiveness. So this goes right into the National Development Plan of the country. And of course, as we all know, in 2015, we all communicated our INDCs, which later became NDCs. And then in 2018 to 2021, the National Planning Commission in the presidency engaged in what we call the Pathways for a Just Transition dialogue. The aim of this dialogue was to develop a national vision for a long-term net zero economy, and this is still in process. It was meant to have concluded, but due to COVID, I think some of the final concluding steps were shelved. And of course, as you have recently seen, we submitted our low emissions development strategy to the UNFCCC, and we are also in a process of updating our NDC and also finalizing our legislative framework, the climate change bill. So that is the history of how South Africa has approached these climate change issues. But moving on to my slides are jumping up and down here. On the net zero specifically, South Africa's low emission development strategy, which was communicated recently to UNFCCC, is very specific. And once again, allow me to quote from that. We somewhere in the strategy, we emphasize these issues of the net zero, and with us commit to ultimately moving towards a goal of net zero carbon emission by 2050. This is what it is contained in our LETS. This goal, how it will be achieved to ensure a just transition and how the economic advantage of the transition will be examined, will be formally communicated in future iterations of this strategy. So this is our first offer. This is our intent, this is our intention. It shows clearly the trajectory that we are undertaking as a country, and it is reflected as such in the LETS. But we are not alone as national government. We are supported by large metros or cities and business, as well as civil society. And in particular here, our large cities or metros have signed up to many of international agreements that support the net zero. So it's not only a matter of national government, but our cities and business are highly involved in this process. What I can also say is that the technical and consultative process is underway at different levels of government and elsewhere, particularly as we outline our enhanced NDC. And what has been our key challenges and opportunities as we were doing the LETS and many other strategies? As many of you know, that our challenges in terms of emissions largely comes from the electricity, the transport and industry. However, we think that the revolution in cost of renewable energies and the abundant wind and sunlight in South Africa create massive opportunities for us to leapfrog forward, but also require a planned phase down of coal dependency. So this is where the issue of the just transition comes in. And we have recently outlined how important this issue is to us, because we've got high levels of unemployment, and as a developing country like many others, we've got other development challenges. So we need a strategy to replace the coal jobs and address associated development challenges and maximize the benefits for the country. And this is all captured under this notion of just transition for us. Much detailed work needs to be done at sectoral level and subsectoral level on this. Of course, some of this has already started. For instance, I've already talked about the NPC process. but there is also technical work to update the NDC that also touch on this. And there's a very important work from the business sector, from our National Business Initiative, as well as our Business Unity South Africa process. It's also doing some technical work around this. Of course, the city level planning for net zero is also an ongoing process. So all in all, what I want to share is that the much needed detailed technical work at sectoral level is underway. Well, let me turn to the international community because, as we know, climate change is an issue that will be solved by all of us, as already alluded to by other speakers. In the Paris Agreement, we talk about the well below 2 degrees and also moving towards 1.5 degrees. And this is also then taken forward in the IPCC 1.5 special report. This, to be clear, this cannot be achieved outside a multilateral process. So we need everyone, as Kelly indicated in the first presentation, every hand has to be on deck. But to really achieve these Paris goals, our view is that this requires 3 elements to it. And we are very firm on this one. We believe that developed countries need to show leadership, both in GHG reduction and associated technology development. We believe that current net zero goals from developed countries are laudable, but not sufficient to address requirements in the IPCC special report. Our view is that this should happen sooner than net zero in developed countries, sooner than 2050. And not using offsets will also assist a lot. And the second point is that we need to be imaginative, meaning that large-scale support for faster transition in developing countries to ensure rapid reduction and meeting development objective. So we need support on the issue of just transition. And this support has to be new and additional, but it should be all aimed at assisting all of us in developing countries to reach these targets and these goals that we are setting for ourselves. And the last point that I want to make, which also involves the issue of equity, it's around the issue of carbon sinks. We believe these are very important. These are mainly in developing countries. A multilateral cooperation will be vital to develop and extend this according to the principles of the Paris Agreement. The IPCC special report on 1.5 also highlight the importance of carbon sinks. Therefore, we believe that we should give much needed support to developing countries because largely these carbon sinks are found in developing countries, including the forest, as we all know. But in short, this is the presentation. This is where we are as a country. In summary, work has already started, but we need the support from our partners to really achieve this. But even more important, this is a task for all of us. It's not going to be helpful if some are on board and others are not on board. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Some really important points raised there. And I just want to highlight something that both you and Archie mentioned, which is that the work on these long-term strategies isn't finished in 2020 and it's not finished at COP26 and not even when the strategies are submitted, because they really are these living documents that give countries the chance to revise and bring forward new things in these strategies. So we're going to do one more quick interactive polling session with our attendees before we go to the question and answer and discussion. And thanks to those of you that have already posted very good questions in our Q&A box. So if you go back to menti.com and enter this code here, I believe this should be the correct code. It's different than your first code. Then we'll have very quick set of questions, and then we'll turn it over to discussion and question and answer. So let's go to our first interactive polling question. And again, if you missed the code on the first slide, it's right up here at the top, along with the website. So if you are engaged in work related to a country level net zero goal, what features of such a target are you prioritizing? Please feel free to select as many as you think apply. And again, the text is a bit small on the screen here, but should be, of course, easily legible in your Menti window. So far, a pretty balanced choice of answers, but it seems like just transition and equity is something that is really at the forefront of people's minds with these net zero targets, and something that was obviously mentioned by Marcela. So we'll just give this one a couple more seconds for a few more responses. Okay, and with that, we can move on to our next question here. So what are some of the most pressing challenges you have encountered if you're involved in net zero target setting, or that you expect that countries would encounter when designing and communicating their net zero targets? This question is a slightly different format, so you'll see our kind of word cloud pop up here as we get some answers. Lots of different answers popping up here. I see finance is a big one. Achievability, interesting. Data, a very important piece. We'll just give a few more seconds here. Very interesting to see all the different responses that are popping up, but you can see there are definitely some kind of larger words at the middle here that a lot of people are thinking about: finance, just transition, political will, equity, the availability of data. Okay, so I'm going to stop the polling there. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for our discussion and our question and answer session. So I saw that, okay, Allison from ECIU had a question to Archie that has now been answered in the Q&A box. But Archie, if there is anything you want to come in addition on that point, please feel free. And others, please feel free to ask your questions in the question box for any of our panelists, or you can ask more broad questions and we'll pass those along. Archie, did you want to come in on anything additional to Allison's question?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to Alison. Like I say in the chat, it's a really pertinent question. And we need to balance the fact that we absolutely respect the Paris. So just for those who haven't seen, Alison's question is about how once we add up the enhanced NDCs, there'll still be a gap to achieving 1.5 or even 2. So how will the COP26 presidency open up a discussion on international action to close that gap? So we have the Paris architecture, which has the global stocktake and the 5-year ratchet. And in that respect, this is only the first chance. This is, in fact, some people have described it as a prototype version of the ratchet, because we haven't had a full global stocktake. We had a Talanoa dialogue in 2018, and now we have countries coming forward with new enhanced ambition. Equally, the urgency of the action that's required right now, action by 2030, means that we do not have long to wait and see, and to see how trends develop. So I think we will need, as a global community, to ask ourselves that question as to what, when we see what comes forward, and it's too early to preempt that now, but when we see the level of ambition that's come forward in light of the science, what does that mean? And what kind of collective response might be appropriate? Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I see we have another question kind of open to all the panelists on negative emissions. Is the role of negative emissions or greenhouse gas removals currently seen as a risk or as an opportunity in the negotiations around ambition? Kelly, maybe I can ask you to come in on that first, and then I will open it up to other panelists.
Sure, maybe I can just talk generally and then also ask Archie to speak to the specifics about the negotiations, as well as Marcella. What we know is, to get to net zero emissions, there will be some residual emissions, so to speak, in hard to abate sectors that, right now, given what we know about current technologies and costs, they are more challenging to reduce. And as a result, they will be balanced, as Richard had mentioned and is in the Paris Agreement, they will be balanced by removals. Those removals can come from a variety of different approaches. Some of them are, we've known for decades, and our most handy solution, which is, protecting our forests and restoring them, but also other natural solutions in terms of soils, and some more advanced solutions, such as biochar, for example, are starting to be investigated. And then there are technological solutions for carbon removal as well, which include, for example, direct air capture and storage, which are really just at more of their infancy in terms of RD&D. The challenge is that the scale of carbon removal assumed in the models is very significant. It means that we have to pull out all of the stops in terms of protecting our natural sinks. But in addition, we need to pursue technological approaches if what the models suggest in terms of the scale of removals is actually what we'll need to pursue. Now, certainly, there's going to be an important interplay between the rate of decarbonization and the amount of removals that we rely upon. So I think what's essential is that each country think about the potential for carbon removals in their country, but also send an incredibly clear signal for decarbonization, because one of the challenges, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that net zero targets kind of obfuscate the need for decarbonization in sectors if you don't specify how much removals you're kind of banking on. And at the same time, it doesn't actually send a very clear signal in terms of how to scale up carbon removal if you don't know what kind of scale you're looking for. And that's why in our paper, we had suggested these separate targets for decarbonization and carbon removal, but both are essential. But it is really essential to make sure that removals are never an excuse for decarbonizing. But similarly, we need to make significant investments in protecting our natural sinks, as well as scaling up technological ones as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. Archie or Marcella, would you like to come in on that, or Richard?
I'm happy to, and I completely agree with Kelly. I think it's an opportunity because it is necessary when you look at the models. but absolutely it cannot be used as an excuse to let anyone off the hook, or for kind of overly optimistic wishful thinking or delaying the action that is required now. I think that there are connections to some of the work that we're doing through, we have 5 presidency campaigns that we are working on in order to accelerate climate action. And one of those is about nature-based solutions. And I think it's really important that as we look at the opportunity of negative emissions, greenhouse gas removals, that we are also making sure that we are protecting and preserving our ecosystems and our natural heritage at the same time. And that in tackling climate change, we are also looking for the synergies and not the tensions with protecting nature and biodiversity. Thanks.
Thank you. Marcelo?
Yeah, well, this is very challenging for South Africa, precisely because we've got a very small land sector and very low potential geological for CCS. So net zero, in actual fact, for South Africa means almost complete decarbonization. Globally, though, I think nature-based things, and that's my view, should be central to discussions on the net zero, including forest and other options. And this should receive more central attention. But for us, as I indicated, this is very, very challenging for the reasons that I've just outlined.
Thank you for that. And Richard?
Yes, I'd like to just echo what was just said, starting with Kelly on the fact that we need to maximize the efforts on mitigation for those sectors that we know are hard to abate now. But if you look 10 years back, the hard to abate sectors are not the same as today. We are making progress in places we didn't expect. However, if you look at the 1.5 scenarios and you look at the global map of where mitigation and net zero and sinks are going to be located, you see that this is not one that reflects development level or anything that we can relate to equity. There are physical constraints that exist. I think Marcela just explained the situation for South Africa. And so it's important to anticipate where are the resources that we'll need to go after for significant sinks removal, in addition to all the technology that we can pull out for these, because this will indicate what sort of policies these countries need to put in place, but what type of support they might need to actually go into these extensive sinks that we will need down the line for extensive carbon removal.
Thank you all for those answers. So we still have a few minutes left and we have a few open questions here. So first, a question to Kelly. I fully agree that net zero targets should ideally cover emissions from international bunkers, shipping and aviation. Attributing emissions from international shipping in particular isn't so straightforward. Do you have any ideas or recommendations on how best to approach that issue?
Thanks. Yeah, I have to admit I'm not a national inventory expert, but I guess first I think transparency is going to be really critical here, so that those can understand what's included and excluded, and following the latest IPCC guidance here to make sure that it's consistent with the agreed upon approaches. But I don't know if Marcela or Archie or Richard know the ins and outs of how that's treated in the inventory and want to come in here. But we can come back and respond to that also afterwards. But I think, what's critical is just that it follows kind of best practice that's agreed upon under the IPCC, and there is full transparency, also to the extent that there are multiple methods, and that these methodological challenges get resolved over time as well.
Thanks, Kelly. Certainly not an easy question. And another question is about the relationship between NDCs and net zero targets. So I would open this up to any of the panelists. Are NDCs and net zero long-term strategies being synthesized, or are most countries formulating NDCs in the absence of a long-term target? If so, is it too late to remedy that before COP26 in this round of NDCs? Would anyone like to take a first stab at that? Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I can have a first stab at it. I mean, I believe, but Marcella and Archie, who were actual negotiators in the Paris Agreement, can confirm or not. But I believe the intent has been that the long-term strategy are there to guide the future ramping up of ambition under near-term goals. However, in the cycle that we're seeing now, some countries have managed to do that. I can point to Portugal, Marshall Islands, and there are many more that are going to come to the front. But because of the legally binding nature of NDCs, there has been a tendency to focus on the NDCs first, and now is coming the turn of developing LTS. I believe the next cycle might be more productive in that sense, with the LTS actually driving more of the ambition in NDCs. But this has been the spirit indeed.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to
Archie?
come in, but equally, Marcella, if you would like to go first, I'm happy.
No, you go. You go. It's
Sure. So the interrelationship between long-term strategies and NDCs is a really interesting one, and you're right that in terms of the theory, that setting that long-term beacon and then working out the steps towards it is both practically and often in many cases politically the pathway towards greater ambition. They're not, as I recall, formally linked in that way in terms of the text, but for many countries that is the approach they've taken. However, where we are now is that we are facing the fact that and in fact, I was in a discussion with some colleagues in Slovenia yesterday about exactly this question, where I was challenged on why are we talking about 2050, given the urgency of climate action now? We should just be focusing on nationally determined contributions. And even that was deemed by some to be, 2030 was too long a horizon. It should be, what are the actions every country is taking this year, which will really shift the dial? And the fact is, therefore, it is not an either or, it needs to be both. And for many systems, particularly given the impact of many government systems of COVID, that is a really difficult ask to be riding both those horses, the long-term horse and also the short-term horse. And I think we have to just be sensitive to that. And we have to be clear that in Paris, there is the expectation, the invitation of long-term strategies, and the expectation on highest ambition, new enhanced NDCs. And we have to encourage and work with countries and support them to do both. And I don't think we want to get into a trade-off of one versus the other, but I'd be really interested in others' views, including the many people on this call. I think that's a much broader conversation. Thanks.
Yep, so I'll bring in Marcella and then Kelly on that point.
yeah. Our current NDC is set in the context of our long-term target, and specifically in the current update that we are doing on the NDC, we are considering the implications of a long-term net zero target. But as Archie said, the NDC targets will be limited to short-term targets, and that is just the way the Paris architecture works. So you've got the NDCs that focus on short-term targets, but as you draft those in mind, you need to have your long-term ambitions and goals in mind. But just for information purpose, when we publish the current the NDC that we are working on, we are going to reflect on this shift in the thinking on the long-term strategy. But this is just for information purpose. I don't know what more to add to this, but the architecture is that is such that you've got to have short-term targets that are reflected in the NDCs, but those have to sort of be in line with your long-term thinking. It's only when you have your long-term strategy that the two can be in sync. But the NDCs are very important because they allow you to adjust. Like now we are being called upon to adjust by the IPCC special 1.5 degree special report. So if we did not have the NDCs, would still be stuck in the previous thinking. So the notion of 5-yearly NDC cycles is quite important, and I think it is correctly reflected in the Paris Agreement. So that is where the two sort of come together. And as I've said, the long-term strategies themselves, they are documents that also needs to be updated. So nothing is cast in stone. You update as you move along based on the new science and the technology that is available at that stage. So the two, I think, in my view, work well together. It's just that in the beginning we started first with the INDCs before we could introduce the issue of the long-term strategies. Thanks.
Thank you for that. We almost made it a full hour before my cat made an appearance. So Kelly, I'll let you answer that, and then we'll see if we have time for one more quick question before we wrap up at 1/4 after. So Kelly.
Good. Just to quickly mention, I put this in the chat with that question, but we wrote a commentary basically looking at 3 scenarios. One is kind of the ideal that you mentioned, where you have the LTS first and then the NDCs come afterwards. A second scenario in which the LTS development and NDC update are being done in parallel. And this can be kind of messy, but if done thoughtfully, you can kind of take advantage of some of the processes, whether or not it's modeling inputs or stakeholder dialogues, et cetera. And then the last scenario in which you don't have the ideal in which the LTS follows an NDC update process. And, you know, as Archie had said, you certainly don't want to delay any kind of NDC update just because there's no LTS. But I think, you know, an NDC can be updated with consideration of long-term goals in mind. And even if those long-term vision of a country hasn't been specified, certainly, you know, the Paris Agreement establishes those goals, and one can think about what an NDC implies in terms of lock-in of carbon-intensive technologies and behavior and policies, and the considerations of, you know, what that implies in terms of a decarbonization rate after the NDC is updated from 2030 onwards. So I encourage you to look at that paper if it might be of interest. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to all our panelists. We are at time. I know we have a couple of outstanding questions left, but so I invite you to kind of follow up with our panelists offline. Thank you, Richard, Marcella, Kelly, and Archie for this really excellent and informative presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. There is a kind of showing QR code here for the WRI Net Zero paper, but I believe there was a link posted to that in the chat. As I said, we can share, there we go. We can share a recording of this call as well as some of the slides. And please do check out the resources here and feel free to follow up with outstanding questions to our panelists. So thank you all very much for joining. And have a lovely rest of your day wherever you may be.